Aviad, welcome to THub, to Hyderabad, to Telangana, and to India.
Thank you for having me.
I know it's not your first time here. You said it's your fourth time. And I think it'll be interesting to hear what is the new or different thing that you've noticed here in your fourth trip. Not just to Hyderabad. Tell me Hyderabad and India.
Well, in Hyderabad, I would say, okay, a lot more buildings, right? So it seems okay that
That's
a lot
very
of
much
people
like us.
seems that the city is growing, right? And I think that's a good sign.
Good.
You mentioned I've been in 4 times already, right? So I traveled in four main cities. I've been to Delhi, Mumbai, Hyderabad, and Bangalore. Each one of them is very different
Very
in
different.
nature. This city is definitely infused with a lot of innovation and technology. So it's kind of my forte. So I love coming here. And the food
That's
is great. I love the food.
food's great.
Food is great.
I would agree.
Yes.
Let me change gears. Aviad, so before we even jump into Broadridge, we jump into fintech, we jump into tokenization and all the good stuff happening with AI. I think it will be nice to for just people to, for our listeners to know who you are and what's going on. So I don't want to do, bookish intros. We know your background. You've surfed, you've played basketball professionally. There's something that I've always read about and been inspired by. So I wanted to ask you that question. Tell me, what is the athlete's mindset, and what does it mean to you? Are you a different person when you're playing professionally versus you're performing, or you're being productive at work? Tell me a little bit about that.
So I'll tell you something that I tell my two young kids. I have a 6 and a 4-year-old. So I tell them something that I actually drew from my professional career is that sometimes you win, you always learn. And I take that very seriously in my workplace, and I also when I lead people and teams. I think that every experience in life, especially as a professional athlete, you're under tremendous pressure. You have to deliver and you have to execute, and you put yourself at the highest standards. I think what I like to do with myself is make sure that I'm in a position that I always learn and applying those learnings. And when you apply those learnings, you're able to uncover opportunities, you're able to inspire other people, and essentially, you can be successful and drive to success. And I think that's kind of something, kind of a philosophy for life. I think if you bring that into a working environment, whether it's a large corporation or a small startup, you give yourself a shot to win.
So you never lose, basically.
With my
If you win
philosophy,
some,
no. With my
you
philosophy,
win
no. No.
sometimes, you
Yes.
said, but you always learn.
I'm thinking about life, right? Life is all about experiences, about meeting different people,
Yeah.
meeting different environments, being adaptable, adjustable, and essentially learning.
I've played some sport, not professionally, but I've actually learned that sport in general teaches you how to, you know, uh, accept, face, understand when somebody is better than you, and when you actually lose.
Right.
So it's a very, very alternative take, very alternative take, and I'm hoping a lot of these alternative takes will flow into our conversation today.
One of the most important things for athletes, as a side note, right, is recovery time. But people often think about recovery time,
And
right,
nobody's thinking about that at
from a
work.
physical perspective. It's not a physical; it's a mental perspective, right? So when you are facing a failure, you need to recover from that very quickly, learn from it, right, and pivot. So recovery time, it's more mentally and philosophically rather than physically.
Very interesting. I have my own personal anecdote on that, but I learned it the hard way last year that recovery is not about speed, it's about recovering well.
Yeah.
So when people say, hey, wish you a speedy recovery, I now write that, and auto text nowadays,
Yeah.
it does that. Actually go back
Great.
and delete that, and I write, wish you a recovery that goes well, or you recover well, right? More than
Absolutely.
speedy. I
Absolutely.
spent my last year recovering from a motorcycle crash. Broke a bunch of bones. Obviously, I'm all good and sitting here now. That's what actually taught me that don't be in a hurry. Take your own time. And
Yeah.
what's interesting is in my recovery, the mental recovery was way more important, right? In general,
Absolutely.
and it's your mental state was way more important.
Yeah.
But learned a lot from recovering in general.
Yeah.
Amazing. Let's talk a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about what are the changes you're seeing at work. And this is not a Broadridge question. You've been, at a famous retailer which went online for the first time. You worked for a media content digital strategy, and now of course you're at a fintech company which is at the forefront of what's going to happen in this world, on that side of the industry. But this is a question that is not related to that. This is a question saying, since you've seen such roles and you've been in such organizations, there's so much changing around us in terms of work and what happens at work. From that vantage point, as well as where you are today, tell me how the workplace is changing with AI, with agents. And I know we've just begun to adapt these things every day at the workplace, but I want your personal thesis on this, on what is the direction of how the workplace will evolve. And of course, we don't know what it's going to look like in a couple of years or a decade from today, but we know that this month and the next few are going to be different. What's your How do you see it changing?
I think it's a combination of things. I mean, you kind of touch on the technological advances. I think essentially what drives the changing in a working place is the type of people and talent that you bring on board, is the mentality of those people, right? How open they are to learn different things, and how do they apply it into their roles and in their expanded roles and responsibilities. And so when you think about technology, I always view technology as more of a catalyst or an enabler. And I think organizations that are able to combine the right talent with the right technology have better chances, right, of making themselves a name in the ecosystem as a whole. They're able to drive change. They're able to hire the right people. And essentially, they're making our lives much, much easier. The type of companies that are putting the customer at the forefront of their operation, of their technology advancements, and the ability to develop services are the ones who are going to win. And I think that, if you think about financial service companies, you think about retailers or social media, the ones who really are successful are the ones who are able to understand the customer needs. The problem is that customer needs are ever changing, right? And so you have to continue and keep up with the pace of demand. Also, if you think about who we are today, right? We're in the year 2025. If you start comparing customer needs for 10 years or 20 years ago, it was very, very different. And so when you start kind of mapping out all of those variables and how you put them together, how you put the right strategy, you hire the right people, you train them the right way, you put them in the right spot, you have a better chance of actually winning and accelerating growth.
Yeah, the good news, about what you were just saying, is that everything that you just mentioned is applicable to also what startups do. There are a few differences which I'll point out, but I think a lot of founders today are also thinking about what the future of building, or what would the future of work look like for them. And we work with hundreds of founders as THub, and that gives us the fortune to actually have a view on this. So that's what they're also always talking about. But there's a slight difference. You said that customer needs are ever evolving, and that's the bad news. I think for founders, it's the exact opposite. The good news is that customer needs are always ever changing, so there's always an opportunity to go and build something new, to disrupt, to bring in a new product into the market for solving for customer needs. But earlier in our conversation, before we even sat down to do this, you were talking about skill set, mindset, right? And toolkits, right, in general,
Yeah.
right? I'd love to hear how that is changing, in not just at Broadridge, specifically, but in general at the workplace, and what you're seeing, because you talked about talent hiring. Are you looking at these things a little bit differently now? What these, kits look like?
Absolutely. So you mentioned, a couple of things. Obviously, the framework, the mindset, skill set, tool set, which I think is one that every organization, regardless if it's a small startup, mid-sized company, or a large corporation, have to apply. I think that even on a government level, right, you
Hmm.
see that, and obviously, you know, government agencies tend, okay, to be very complacent, right, and follow the same protocol without the desire to change. But I think when you start unpacking each one of those components, um, you start seeing, okay, the differences, right, between companies who become very, very successful and are able to attract the right talent versus the ones who are almost trying to play more defense, kind of the basketball analogy, right, and try to protect existing operation.
Interesting.
And I think more than that, the whole notion of globalization took a very, very, very different, I think, type of a lens, right? With the evolution or the disruption of different technologies come into place, open up different markets, technologies like AI and blockchain and others that are really putting companies right now at the forefront of rethinking about their needs. Going back to our previous question about kind of the talent, um, and the customer needs, when I go into a conversation, right, whether it's as a startup advisor or as a consultant or even working for Broadridge, I start by asking the question of my client or someone, okay, what are your needs? What are some of the challenges you're facing today? I think if you're going into conversation and trying to unpack that, you're able to create empathy and sympathy, right, to your clients, number one. Number two, you can start thinking outside of your existing operation of how can you actually help that individual, that entity, that corporation. And I think oftentimes when you think about talent, that's what you need to do. How do you train people to ask the right questions? It's never start by being solution oriented. It starts by addressing some of the needs, asking the right questions, having empathy and listening. If you're able to do that, you're check marking right the mindset. The skill set and the tool set are one that obviously follow suit. Some companies are very, very lucky, right, to have the right tool sets. And some companies, okay, are struggling more with the skill set. But if you're starting with a mindset and you build a culture that is open to questions, is opening to questioning each other about what you do today, where you want to be in the future, and how is that different, you're able to be successful.
Very interesting. This is a good segue into Broadridge. Let's talk about that. Tell me a little bit about Broadridge. How big is the company? What is the culture like at Broadridge? And not just workplace culture, but tell me about principles, tenets. What is it, that you guys do every day at the workplace? And then I'd love to pick your brains on what's happening in fintech. How are you guys thinking about that? What is Broadridge's focus areas? And then we'd go into our, main piece chunk of the
Yeah.
conversation, which is tokenization.
So I'll tell you, kind of a true story and a personal story about Broadridge. When I was brought to Broadridge about 6 years ago, I had no idea who Broadridge is, right? And I had to do some research, and I realized that Broadridge is considered to be almost the pipeline of the financial service ecosystem. And when I start to unpack that, I realized that we touch on so many of the day-to-day operations that financial services companies are dealing with. But kind of zooming out for that a bit, we are by definition a global fintech. We have roughly 15,000 global employees. We have a very large employee base here in India. We're very proud of that. We have over 5,000 employees, primarily on the technology side. And as a global fintech, you would expect us to obviously drive and build solutions for pretty much any market on the globe. We are very much focused primarily on the North American market, which has been very successful for us across different domains. But with the evolution right now of the regulatory kind of landscape, advances in technology, we're seeing more and more demand for serving global clients based on what we do today and where our strategy is laying itself across different domains. Kind of asked me more about who Broadridge is. We're actually really one big family. There is both a desire and a recognition of talent, a company that's really think about innovation in day-to-day operation, thinking about the future. The biggest testimony for that was the establishment of our own innovation lab, which was funded about 3.5 years ago, which I was heading it, called 605 Studios. The goal was not just to drive success through the services, but is really to go into the type of conversation with our clients and help them evolve, help them figure out how to play to their strengths. And so when you start thinking about building an innovation culture and you have the level of commitment from your executive leadership team all the way down, right, to all the associates globally, you're able to demonstrate that success and pretty much leverage the success we had for the past couple of decades into the future.
Very interesting. What is the future? Just where you left it off. What is the future for not just Broadridge, but just broadly the future for a pipeline, in the financial?
Had I had a crystal ball, I would have tell you that. I probably would have also won the lottery yesterday. I think it was like $1.8 billion yesterday in the US. I did not win, I can tell you that. But with all seriousness, if we think about the future of finance, the future, I think, of technology, the future of client or consumer facing applications, in my mind, is really about thinking about the whole picture of globalization. I mentioned before, you know, we are very lucky, I think, to live in an era where we see significant advancements in technology. Our goal right now in our role is to translate that into something concrete and tangible, can truly disrupt the ecosystem. We had our offsite kind of conversation before, right? And you mentioned Uber, right?
Yeah.
Uber is a great example, right? Where you took a very distinct type of a service, right? The taxi service of the world, and disrupted it. and they disrupt it by looking into the client needs. And I think where we're heading right now is more and more success stories like Uber, where you start taking existing operation, existing technologies, and you're starting to map those out into areas where you can create operational efficiency, you can create higher value at a lower cost, and you really demonstrate this whole globalization of services. Yeah. It's going to manifest itself right in financial services through tokenization. We're going to talk about it in a second. But I think we're on the cusp right now of operating in a very different way, and that going to goes across industries.
Yeah. No, you talked about a bunch of very interesting things. You talked about, innovation labs. You talked about which way Broadridge would go and principles. I want to de-link. I want to de-link what you just said. The three things that you just said that you think are the directional sort of ways that not just the company, the industry will take. De-link that from where do you think, and then bring it back and connect it back to where do you think is the opportunity for innovation / for startups and founders who are listening to this. On the fintech, the financial industry, the financial services industry, the financial products industry. And of course, we're not talking about, asset management, and we're not talking about transaction advisory. We're purely talking about technology rails. We're talking about platforms.
Yeah.
Are the three things the same that you just mentioned, or are they slightly different? Apply this to that world and tell me, like, if I come to you and I say, I'm raising, an X million dollar check, and I'm ready to go, and I want to build in this space, which is the direction you'd point me to? And assume I don't have any idea, and don't worry about the three sets you said: skill set, mindset, tool set. Assume they're all there, right?
No, it's a good question. I think unpacking that obviously going to take us a lot of time, but I will touch on a few points. I think tokenization is a great example where you're going to start seeing a lot of democratization and access to different assets that traditionally were not available and accessible for the average consumer or the average investor. I think that's an area of disruption that is already starting right now.
Tokenization that is not available to the average consumer currently. That's one. So that democratization.
That's a big area. That's the democratization, or I would say even access, right, to different type of assets that currently were not available. I think that's a big area. The other area I think we're going to start seeing already disruption is around identity management, right? And I think it has a strong correlation to financial services, but also kind of across industries, right? It's going to disrupt insurance companies and healthcare providers, etc. So identity is a really big piece of that. And then going back to actually a very fundamental technology advancement, it's AI, right? And AI on its own, going to start creating all of those, I think, tools and services that going to create higher efficiencies, right? So time to market, time to scale, and time to revenue. All of those going to be called primarily to AI or the use of AI with the different wrappers of technology around it.
Yeah, and AI is of course a horizontal. It's going to cut through even the first two things that you said.
Absolutely.
Which is a part, tokenization operations in some ways, as well as identity management. Very interesting three areas, if you will. I think you've ensured in the last 5 minutes of conversation, you've queued tokenization for us. So let's just jump right in. Before we talk about tokenization as an opportunity for innovation, for startups, for Broadridge, for fintech in general, let's just talk about what is tokenization. I think it gets conveniently, and sometimes without information, people just end up synonymizing it with so many other things. Tokenization is sometimes assumed and synonymized with a blockchain, then with crypto, and then with Web3, and then everything else under the sun. So I want to ensure we take a step back, and we don't care about separating out those definitions and synonyms, but just pick tokenization, explain it to explain it as simply as you can. And tell us what parts of that definition or explanation really matter given where we are today, right?
Absolutely.
Because historically, there's so much to understand.
Correct.
Let's keep that aside.
And historically, to your point, right, it's actually emphasizing, right, a bigger problem, which is the literacy gap, right, of understanding exactly what tokenization or even what blockchain is. I'm sure everybody hears about it, but they have no idea what it really means or how it's impacting, right, the day-to-day. So tokenization, I think in the most simplistic way, is really fractionalizing ownership, right? And that's how I kind of view it, and that's how I explain it to people around me. I had this discussion with my in-laws a couple of weeks ago when my mother was like, what is tokenization? And I told her, okay, think about this nice painting that you have here, right? And let's assume that costs $10,000. So that's the value of it right now. right? If you can fractionalize that, right, and you can give ownership, right, half of it,
Yeah.
a quarter of it, okay, to other people, you can start unpacking the value of your assets. And I think if you start thinking about every piece of asset that each one's own or would like to own, this is where tokenization is becoming more of the catalyst for that. Now, there is a difference, okay, between tokenization on the institutional side versus on the retail side, right? But essentially, you're unpacking and you're creating higher value for fraction of assets. And I think that the way when you start thinking about that, then it's becoming more of a market mover, right, for every type of operation or service that is already presenting itself today. And that goes across industries like we mentioned before.
Yeah, let's double click this a bit. And I know that everything else, Web3, blockchain, currency for crypto or otherwise, all of those things come in later.
Yeah.
They are operations of tokenization in some ways. They're the hows, not the whats. Let's double click this a little bit more. What are some of the use cases? And I'm not asking examples, but what are some of the reasons? Tokenization is technically democratizing ownership of an asset.
Yeah.
Right? What are the reasons that you're seeing? Like, where is the value proposition or product market fit for tokenization? Why does tokenization as a concept need to exist? Why does it need to scale beyond the simple fact that it makes expensive assets, ownable?
Yeah.
Let's go beyond that.
Yeah.
And tell me, we'll come to examples later, but just tell me theoretically,
Yeah.
what are some of those key pillars that is almost implicitly enforcing tokenization of some assets?
Yeah. So I think I kind of touched on those terms before a bit. I can double click. Right? I mean, liquidity is obviously one of those things. Okay, that is really kind of
So you can do
as
partial
enabler.
liquidity for partial ownership.
Yes. And I think I talked about globalization, right? So if you start thinking about okay, one big market instead of those localized markets, that's an enabler or a catalyst, okay, out of tokenization. We always give the example that if you think about a company, let's say like Broadridge, right, or even Apple, that is right now is only trading right in the United States, but through tokenization, you start opening up right to global investors. So you're going from roughly, let's say 100 million right investors in the US to 2 billion global investors. That's on its own, okay, it's the power of tokenization, right? So it's the ability to take a very, very large global in nature, but still very siloed type of an operation and make it as small as accessible as possible. And I think this is where the definitions, right, of how you apply tokenization, what can you do with it, are still ill-defined a bit. But when you start thinking of mapping out the big picture around that, this is what gets people excited, right? This is why Innovation Lab exists today. You're taking an infrastructure opportunity and you start unpacking it right into tangible things. I think going back to the kind of the global nature, it's really access into assets for the most part on the institutional side and on the retail side that were not really available before, which makes a lot of difference right now. And in the US, I'll give another example, right? Think about the insurance company or the insurance space as a whole. One that is very, very convoluted and obviously heavily regulated. You start thinking about the type of things that you can do with tokenization around title insurance, around driver licenses, but identity management. That's becoming extremely interesting and a lot of pockets of experiments already in the US around that. If you're going to start replicating it across the world, that's going to become really, really interesting.
Let me just recap that. So you said democratization, tokenization enables democratization of assets for affordability, of course, for unlocking liquidity. You also said, in some ways indirectly unlocking access to other forms of assets because that currency then becomes, exchange in some ways,
Correct.
for this. Give me some colorful examples for this that you're seeing recently. I don't want to go back to, um, examples from COVID times. I want to see more modern, recent post AI examples. Is there anything that you're seeing, given the vantage point you're at, where there's some interesting tokenization of some very interesting assets happening for very interesting, like the Apple, share price example you just gave is interesting, but that's the traditional market sense.
Right.
Give me where you're saying, and I don't want to talk about NFTs, and tell me anything that you've seen that's for a physical asset, maybe for a specific use like liquidation, that's happening in a very interesting way post AI. And I should correct myself. Post AI is extremely wrong. We're still pre, but we are in the early days of that. So there, have you seen?
So I could give you an example that I actually heard about a month ago in a conference that I attended that actually blew my mind. Um, about this company, without naming names, that decided to tokenize uranium. And when I heard that,
Tokenization of uranium
uranium,
as
yeah,
a natural resource.
yes. And when I started thinking about it, I immediately thought about, okay, who are some of the entities, right, who would even want or will benefit, right, from uranium? And the first thing that came to mind, okay, is probably bad players, right, out there that may want to have access to it. But when you start unpacking that, or even thinking about the bigger picture, you start thinking that access to natural resources, right, that's a really, really big and interesting type of a use case of how you can start enabling, right, from a manufacturing perspective, right, different type of processes, and maybe reducing the cost that goes, okay, with access to those natural resources. That's fascinating, and it's already happening. The second thing, right, you have a lot of natural sources also, okay, in Africa, right? You talk about um, pearls, you talk about gold, you talk about diamonds. Those are all being tokenized right now for the same reason, right? How do you actually take and create higher value at the utmost, I would say, accessibility around it, and start kind of creating marketplaces around the world around those things? That's fascinating, right? And so I think about when I think about tokenization again, is taking different type of assets that you may have the ability at some point in time to put a value in it, but you would never be able to be an owner of it. And that to me is the key here, right? Democratizing and making things much more accessible to the masses. That's going to be a catalyst and driver for economies, global economies, right? I mean, we are sitting obviously here in India, which is, by definition, an emerging economy, probably the largest in the world right now. Open up the Indian market as a whole through the type of talent, the type of resources that this country has to the world is going to come, okay, in the channels of tokenization to some extent. Right? Not just through the institutional, right, rails, but through the common, right, people who have access to it.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's a very big opportunity. I know that a lot of founders have always been thinking on this direction. There's a lot to build and do here, not just from India, for India, but for the world. I think in general, given that tokenization starts with identifying your assets and then figuring out all the operations around blockchain and then a currency, for exchange, a lot of things get stuck up there because it could be related to regulations, to actually acceptance and identity of a certain currency to do it. All of those things play in. But tell me, are there, and I'm using the word ops very conveniently, but for enabling tokenization globally in general, are there 2 or 3 opportunities or directions that you see, both as the innovation lab, and I'm asking this selfishly because I want founders to think about this too. But instead of thinking about crypto, Web3, blockchain as an industry, if we specifically pick the use case of tokenization, and we say within tokenizations there are now very specific use case, there's a lot of ops to be built all around it, right? Which will primarily come from technology and now with AI, right? So I'm trying to bring back those 3 things you said before: tokenization, identity management, and then empowerment of all of this, let me just call operating system using AI.
Let me ask you that question, okay? Because
What am I
obviously, okay,
saying?
because you're obviously leading, okay, one of the largest innovation hubs in the world, right?
But
So
you
I'm sure
promised
that
to
you're.
answer
Yep,
right after.
I'll answer. I'll answer.
There is, I think, I don't think we are necessarily thinking of it, and when I say we, I mean founders in India. We may not be necessarily thinking of it from an angle of tokenization per se. There's a lot of work to be done on identity management. There's a lot of to be done on exchange. There's a lot of work to be done on just communities and networks connecting all of this, because if there is no exchange on which these communities can come in, it's very, very hard. And I think most importantly, there's a lot of work to be done creating liquidity. And if you look at some of the, and I'm broadly using the term fintech, but if you look at some of the fintech innovations that have happened in India in the recent past, and it's not just founders, nonprofits as public entities as well as the government, there has been a massive sort of scope for innovation, massive push for innovation on this front. I'm guessing you've heard of UPI, and you've been tracking.
Actually visited our last time was there. Yes,
yeah,
absolutely.
So if you track it very closely, I'm sure as Broadridge and otherwise, they just quite recently they launched and enabled it in international markets as a payment gateway. And I don't know if you've looked at stats already, but UPI just being in India, transaction volume has already exceeded MasterCard, and in a couple of years it is on track to exceed And this is not using multiple financial products. It's
Correct.
that one scanning thing that you do. Of course, there's RuPay, which is the credit card, but
Yeah.
it's an extremely sophisticated system, that is enabling merchants and consumers, to transact, multiple using multiple infrastructure rails, right? So if you take that as an example, as an opportunity, if you look at some of the most recent, again, fintech examples I'm giving, it's a lot to do with interventions or utilizing what's happening in the public markets,
Yeah.
right? So investing, just a
Correct.
lot of investing apps, right, that have come out, and they have grown because in India, a lot of work, even if I take UPI and investing together, at the end of the day, you're still unlocking access,
Correct.
right, Aviad? There's a billion plus people, right, in one of the world's largest economies,
Yeah.
and this is traditionally a savings economy. So you first create value, at the sort of democratization end by creating highways,
Yeah.
which is the example of UPI, and then you create sort of via media or windows into tapping into that highways. So we are still solving for access, as
So
India.
it's going to come to surprise to you or not. I think you guys are pretty much on par with the rest of the world, right? I think that the world, okay, doesn't really know, okay, to what extent tokenization can be leveraged. Now, there are obviously pockets of experiments, right? I talked about the identity use case. The identity one is fascinating, not just from a tokenization perspective, but also from access and control, right, to the data. And I think then you start layering that, right, with blockchain as a technology, with AI and the ability to translate, okay, different data sets for particular use cases, who has access to it, right? How do you do it in a formal way? You start thinking about layering all of those technologies all together. And tokenization, okay, is only playing, I would say, like one small role within that use case, but it's a critical one, right? Because if you're able to unpack and fractionalize, right, identity component, data sets, right, on different blockchains, and then you start layering management of those data sets, right, across different entities on the institutional side, retail, then it's becoming powerful.
Yeah.
The problem is there are no really distinct use cases today, okay, where you can say, yes, we can prove disruption through that process. We can actually right now use tokenization, right, for identity management, and that's going to yield an X amount more dollars, right, from a revenue perspective. The one example, I can actually read about it, I think a couple of months ago, which is interesting. There are pockets of experiments with tokenization in Africa around microloans, right? So if you think
For
about
microloans.
for microloans, right? So if you think about microloans as a whole, right? Again, it's about access, right? For those who may not have the means, right, to even create a collateral, right, against those loans. And with tokenization, they're able right now to both verify information, put collateral aside, okay, against, right, what has been given, right, as a microloan, and track that over time. And so you're starting to actually get more and more people to participate in becoming more economy movers through that process. But again, those are very, very small experiments that haven't been proven themselves yet, but it's fascinating to see that.
Yeah, yeah, very interesting. Actually, in this last bit that you just mentioned, you also obviously turned the question back on me, but you also flipped a lens that I was thinking about throughout our conversation, which is what you're saying is tokenization is also not the what. Tokenization is a how to many things.
Correct.
And I think that is where I think sometimes we misunderstand it as one topic that we are building for tokenization. But actually, the question is how can you use tokenization and AI and everything
Yeah.
else that's available as tools to us to solve other problems? Because you could argue that identity management is needed for tokenization, but tokenization is a great way to solve for identity management.
Exactly, exactly. And if you think, we kind of talked about very briefly, or we mentioned, okay, the work regulation. So if you think about regulation as a whole, right, there's multiple thing challenges. Number one, and I mentioned before, literacy gap, right? So the ability to understand from a regulatory perspective, what do those technological advances mean?
Yeah.
How do you regulate? How do you create actually favorable regulation to advance those technologies and not decapitate them? This is where we are today. And you can see it not just for tokenization, you see it for digital asset as a whole, you see it for blockchain, you see it for AI. Right? I've been in multiple conversations with global regulators, and the number one thing they're asking is just provide us with information because we want to
Yeah.
learn, right?
Yeah.
So that's number one. The second thing is, some of the existing regulation gonna apply, right, for let's say tokenized, equities or tokenized funds, right? Because if it's a wrapped, right, equity that just has been tokenized, you don't really need to change the regulation. But what happened, okay, when you create a native tokenized rights? Then it's becoming very, very interesting, right? Who is going to regulate it? How are you going to regulate it? What's the data, right, to make sure, okay, that you mitigate the risk associated with it? What kind of use cases you can even use, right, the tokenized security for? How do you track over time ownership of that? How do you, like, all of those questions are not defined yet, but I think this is where innovation labs or innovation hubs essentially have a critical role, because you need to go right now and experiment, and you have to uncover all those use cases,
Yeah.
bring that knowledge back, right, to regulatory bodies, provide them information, and have favorable, right, frameworks around it.
We have so much work to do.
So much
Aviad.
work to do. Yes.
On that note, it's been an absolute pleasure. I just realized that we can go on with this conversation,
Absolutely.
for a while, but I don't know if people will keep listening. So on that note, it's been an absolute pleasure. Any famous last words that you want to leave
First of all,
us
thank
with?
you for having me for the second time. Hopefully, I will be invited for the third time, because I really enjoy both Hyderabad and THub.
You can come back anytime for a conversation. We can record it or not, but you're always welcome.
I admire, obviously, your enthusiasm, right, about driving innovation, not just for THub, but I think for India and the world. And I think you guys have demonstrated so far. So, happy to be here.